His security guard barely looked up from his clipboard. 87-year-old Robert Mitchell stood at the entrance, his weathered hands gripping his invitation, his press suit hanging loose on his frail frame. The ceremony had started 20 minutes ago. The doors were closed. Protocol was protocol. "Sorry, sir. You're too late. We can't let you in now." The words hit Robert like shrapnel. He'd driven 4 hours for this. 4 hours on roads that seemed longer every year. His arthritic hands cramped around the steering wheel, stopping twice because his bladder couldn't hold what it used to. This wasn't just any ceremony. This was the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall Edition. His name was supposed to be read today. The name of every man from his unit who didn't make it home. "Please," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I served. I was there." The guard's expression didn't soften. Behind those glass doors, Robert could hear the muffled sound of speeches, of honor, of remembrance. Everything he'd been fighting to be part of for 50 years. "I understand, sir, but the ceremony is in progress. We can't interrupt now." The old veteran's shoulders sagged. His legs, already unsteady, trembled slightly. He'd survived 3 tours in Vietnam. He'd survived Agent Orange. He'd survived watching his buddies die in rice paddies half a world away. But apparently, he couldn't survive being 20 minutes late to his own recognition ceremony. But they didn't know who they were turning away. They didn't know that Robert Mitchell had carried 17 men to safety during the Tet Offensive. They didn't know he'd refused evacuation twice, staying behind to make sure every wounded soldier made it to the medevac helicopter. They didn't know that the shrapnel scar on his left shoulder came from shielding a 19-year-old kid from Ohio who wrote letters to his mother every night until he couldn't write anymore. If you believe that those who serve deserve more than bureaucratic indifference, if you think that some arrivals are worth waiting for, hit that like button. Because some doors should always open for those who opened the door to our freedom. The ceremony inside continued, but something was stirring in the small crowd gathering outside. Robert hadn't noticed them at first, but other veterans had seen the exchange. They recognized something in his posture, in the careful way he held himself, in the pain that flickered across his weathered face when the guard turned him away. James Morrison, a Desert Storm veteran half Robert's age, had been smoking outside when he witnessed the rejection. He'd seen enough old soldiers to recognize the real ones, the way they carried themselves, even bent with age, the way they respected authority, even when authority didn't respect them back. "Hey," James called out, approaching Robert. "What unit were you with?" Robert turned slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting James's. "1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, 3 tours, 67 to 70. James felt something twist in his chest. 1st Cav. Everyone knew about 1st Cav in Vietnam. These weren't rear echelon guys pushing paperwork. These were the ones who went in first, who stayed longest, who paid the highest price. And they won't let you in?" Robert's laugh was hollow, bitter. "Protocol," they said. "Ceremony's already started." James looked back at the glass doors, at the security guards, at the bureaucratic wall that stood between this old warrior and the recognition he'd earned with blood. Something shifted in his expression. Something hardened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." What happened next would change everything. Because sometimes it takes one person recognizing another person's worth to start a chain reaction that reminds us all what honor really means. James Morrison didn't just walk back to his cigarette. He didn't just shake his head and move on. He walked straight through those glass doors, past the security guards who knew him as a regular at these events, and he found someone who mattered. Someone who could make decisions. Someone who understood that some rules are meant to be broken, when breaking them serves a higher purpose. Inside, the ceremony was reaching its midpoint. Governor Patricia Williams was at the podium, speaking about sacrifice, about remembrance, about making sure no veteran is forgotten. The irony wasn't lost on James as he approached the event coordinator, a sharp-dressed woman with a headset and a clipboard who looked like she managed small crises for a living. "Ma'am," James interrupted, his voice urgent but respectful. "There's a Vietnam veteran outside. 3 tours, 1st Cavalry. They won't let him in because he's 20 minutes late." The coordinator barely looked up, I'm sorry, but we can't interrupt the program now. Security protocols, ma'am. James's voice carried the weight of desert sand and midnight patrols. With respect, he earned the right to be here 50 years ago. These protocols didn't exist when he was carrying wounded soldiers through enemy fire. The coordinator paused. Something in James's tone made her look up from her clipboard, made her see the uniform he wore, made her remember that this wasn't just an event management problem. This was about honoring people who had earned honor in ways most people never would. How old is he? She asked. 87. And he drove 4 hours to be here. The coordinator glanced toward the stage where Governor Williams was still speaking about the debt society owed to its veterans. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore. What's his name? Robert Mitchell, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam. The coordinator's fingers flew over her tablet, searching the guest list, cross-referencing veteran databases. When she found what she was looking for, her expression changed completely. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's not just on the guest list. He's supposed to receive the Distinguished Service Recognition today. His unit citation is part of the ceremony program." James felt vindication and anger warring in his chest. And he's outside being told he's too late. The coordinator was already moving, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she headed toward the stage. Protocol was important, but some things were more important than protocol. Some people were more important than schedules. Governor Williams noticed the coordinator approaching, saw the urgency in her expression, and smoothly transitioned to a pause in her speech. The whispered conversation that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but in those 30 seconds, a decision was made that would remind everyone present what leadership actually looked like. Governor Williams stepped back to the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system to the hundreds of people assembled in the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to pause our ceremony for a moment. We have a situation that requires our immediate attention." A murmur ran through the crowd. Pauses in official ceremonies usually meant problems, emergencies, things going wrong. But Governor Williams's expression suggested something different, something important. "We have learned that one of our honored guests, a Vietnam veteran who was supposed to receive recognition today, is currently outside this building. He arrived 20 minutes after our scheduled start time, and our security protocols prevented him from entering." The murmur grew louder, but the tone was changing. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was recognition, understanding. Robert Mitchell served 3 tours with the 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam. He carried 17 wounded soldiers to safety during the Tet Offensive. He refused evacuation twice to ensure every member of his unit reached medical care. He was awarded the Bronze Star with V-Device for Valor, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantry Badge. The auditorium had gone completely silent. "He is 87 years old. He drove 4 hours to be with us today. And I'll be damned if we're going to let protocol stand between this man and the honor he deserves." The governor's voice carried the authority of her office. But more than that, it carried the conviction of someone who understood that leadership sometimes means knowing when rules serve people and when people are more important than rules. "We're going to suspend this ceremony for 10 minutes while I personally escort Mr. Mitchell inside. Because in my administration, in my state, we don't make heroes wait outside while we talk about honoring heroes. If you're watching this and you believe that real leadership means recognizing what truly matters, that some delays are worth it when they honor those who never delayed when their country called, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. Because these are the stories that remind us what values actually look like in action. These are the moments that define who we are as a people. And these are the leaders who understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop everything you're doing to do the right thing. The auditorium erupted, not in polite applause, but in the kind of sustained emotional ovation that happens when people witness something that restores their faith in human decency. Veterans in the audience stood first, their movements sharp and automatic, the muscle memory of respect, overriding arthritis and age. Then their families stood, then everyone else, until the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding not just the governor's decision, but the principle behind it. Outside, Robert Mitchell was still standing by the glass doors, James Morrison beside him, when those doors suddenly opened, not grudgingly, not with reluctance, but with purpose. Governor Williams herself stepped outside, her heels clicking on the pavement, her expression serious but warm. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Governor Williams. I understand you've had some trouble getting inside." Robert looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face, processing what was happening. Authority figures hadn't always been kind to him over the years. The VA had lost his paperwork twice. Social Security had questioned his disability claims. Bureaucrats had made him wait, made him prove, made him justify his service over and over again. But this was different. This was someone coming to him. "Ma'am," he said, taking her hand with the careful grip of someone whose joints hadn't worked properly in decades. "I don't want to cause any trouble. I know I'm late." "Mr. Mitchell," Governor Williams said, her voice gentle but firm, "You're not late. We're early, and we're not starting this ceremony without you." The walk back into the building was unlike anything Robert had experienced in his civilian life. Governor Williams didn't just escort him. She walked beside him, matching her pace to his careful steps, her hand lightly touching his elbow, not to guide him, but to honor him. The security guards who had turned him away now stood at attention, their earlier indifference replaced by something approaching shame. James Morrison walked on Robert's other side, and behind them, other veterans who had been outside joined the procession. It became a parade of recognition, a moment when bureaucracy stepped aside for humanity. The auditorium doors opened, and the sustained applause that had been waiting for 10 minutes erupted again. Louder this time, more emotional. Robert stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sound, by the sight of hundreds of people on their feet, by the realization that this reception was for him. His eyes, dimmed by age and cataracts, filled with tears he'd been holding back for decades. "Go ahead, sir," Governor Williams said softly. "They're waiting for you." The walk down the center aisle took forever and no time at all. Robert's steps were slow but steady, his back straightening slightly with each row he passed. People weren't just applauding anymore. They were calling out, "Thank you for your service. Welcome home. God bless you." Phrases that had been worn smooth by repetition in other contexts, but felt fresh and genuine in this moment. A young woman in military dress uniform stepped out from her row and saluted as he passed. An elderly man in a World War II veteran's cap reached out to shake his hand. Children who had been fidgeting through the ceremony stood perfectly still, sensing that they were witnessing something important, something they would remember and maybe understand better when they were older. When Robert reached the front of the auditorium, Governor Williams guided him not to the general seating area, but to the place of honor on the stage itself. A chair had been brought out, positioned so he could see the entire audience, so everyone could see him. As he settled into the chair, the applause gradually died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. This wasn't just a ceremony anymore. This was a moment of collective recognition, a community choosing to honor not just military service in general, but this specific person who had served, who had sacrificed, who had survived. Governor Williams returned to the podium, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the audience, a voice called out, "First Cavalry." It was another veteran, recognizing Robert's unit designation. Then another voice, "Air Mobile." Then another, "Vietnam." The calls weren't organized, weren't planned, but they built on each other, creating a roll call of recognition that acknowledged not just Robert's presence, but his service, his unit, his war, his generation. Robert sat in his chair of honor, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, finally receiving the welcome home he'd never gotten 50 years ago. Governor Williams let the moment build, let it breathe, understanding instinctively that some things were more important than ceremony scripts and time schedules. When the voices finally died down, she spoke into a silence that felt sacred. "This is what honor looks like," she said simply. "This is what we mean when we say we support our veterans. Not just in speeches, not just in ceremonies, but in moments like this, when we choose to do the right thing even when it's inconvenient, even when it disrupts our plans, even when it means admitting that our protocols aren't as important as our principles." The remainder of the ceremony took on a weight and significance that nobody present had expected. When Robert's name was called for his recognition, the applause was thunderous but respectful. When he stood to receive his certificate and medal, his movement slow but dignified, the auditorium fell into complete silence. Governor Williams didn't just hand him his recognition. She took time to read his citation, to detail his service, to make sure everyone present understood exactly what this man had done, what he had sacrificed, what he had earned. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, she read, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action during the Tet Offensive, Republic of Vietnam. When his unit came under intense enemy fire, Sergeant Mitchell repeatedly exposed himself to hostile fire to evacuate wounded soldiers. Despite being wounded himself, he refused medical evacuation until all members of his unit were evacuated to safety. His actions resulted in the preservation of 17 lives and exemplified the highest traditions of military service. The words hung in the air, each one carrying the weight of experience most people in that auditorium could never fully comprehend. 17 lives. 17 families who had sons and fathers and brothers come home because this old man, this man who had been turned away at the door 20 minutes ago, had risked everything to save them. When Governor Williams pinned the recognition medal to Robert's lapel, he whispered something that only she could hear. "Thank you for not forgetting us." Her response was equally quiet but clear. "Thank you for not giving up on us." The ceremony continued, but everything that followed was anticlimactic. Robert had become the heart of the event, the living embodiment of everything the ceremony was supposed to represent. Other veterans received their recognitions, other speeches were given, other honors were bestowed, but the day belonged to the 87-year-old man who had almost been turned away at the door. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to file out, something remarkable happened. Instead of leaving, dozens of attendees approached the stage. They wanted to meet Robert, to shake his hand, to thank him personally. Veterans from later wars introduced themselves, creating connections across generations of service. Families brought their children to meet him, understanding that this was a living history lesson more valuable than any textbook. Robert, who had arrived alone and discouraged, found himself surrounded by community, by recognition, by the very thing he had been seeking when he drove 4 hours to attend a ceremony that almost excluded him. James Morrison, the Desert Storm, veteran who had initiated the chain of events that led to this moment, stood to the side watching the interactions. Later, he would describe this as one of the most important things he had ever done in civilian life. "I've been to a lot of these ceremonies," he would tell reporters who covered the story. "They're usually nice, respectful, but kind of routine. Today was different. Today we remembered what these ceremonies are actually for." Governor Williams, surrounded by her own crowd of admirers and political supporters, kept glancing over at Robert, making sure he was okay, that the attention wasn't overwhelming him. But Robert was thriving in a way he hadn't in years. This was what he had been missing. Not just recognition, but connection. Not just acknowledgement of his service, but inclusion in a community that valued that service. The ceremony had given him something he didn't even realize he had been seeking. Proof that his service still mattered, that he still mattered, that the sacrifices he had made decades ago in a jungle on the other side of the world still resonated with people who had never worn a uniform, never heard enemy fire, never carried a wounded friend to safety. The story didn't end when the ceremony concluded. Within hours, local news stations were covering the story of the veteran who was almost turned away and the governor who delayed an entire ceremony to include him. Within days, the story had gone national, picked up by networks and newspapers across the country. But more importantly, it had started conversations in VFW halls and American Legion posts, in family living rooms and church fellowship halls, about how we treat our veterans, about what honor really means, about the difference between following rules and doing what's right. Robert Mitchell returned home to a different life than the one he had left. His phone, which rarely rang anymore, was suddenly busy with calls from old Army buddies who had seen his story on the news. His mailbox, usually filled only with medical bills and prescription advertisements, began receiving letters from strangers thanking him for his service, sharing their own stories, creating connections across the invisible barriers that usually separate veterans from the civilians they protected. More importantly, he had gained something that no ceremony could officially bestow: the knowledge that he was valued, that his service was remembered, that his sacrifices had meaning beyond the official citations and medal ribbons gathering dust in his bedroom drawer. The change in him was visible to anyone who knew him. His neighbors noticed that he walked a little straighter, spoke a little louder, engaged a little more with the world around him. The ceremony had done more than recognize his past service. It had restored his sense of present worth. Governor Williams, whose political career had been built on calculated decisions and careful positioning, found that the most genuine moment of her tenure had been completely unscripted. In the weeks that followed, she would receive more positive feedback about the 10-minute delay than about any legislation she had signed or any policy she had implemented. People understood instinctively that they had witnessed leadership in its purest form: the willingness to do the right thing even when it was inconvenient, even when it disrupted plans, even when it challenged established protocols. The security guards who had initially turned Robert away were not punished or reprimanded. Instead, they became part of a training program that emphasized the difference between following procedures and understanding purpose. They learned to recognize that sometimes the most important part of their job wasn't keeping people out, but knowing when to let people in. The event coordinator, who had initially resisted interrupting the ceremony for one late arrival, became an advocate for flexible protocols that could accommodate the human elements that make ceremonies meaningful rather than just efficient. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community itself. The story of Robert Mitchell became a touchstone, a reference point for discussions about values and priorities. When other situations arose where bureaucracy conflicted with humanity, people would ask, "What would we do if this were Robert Mitchell?" The question became a test, a way of measuring whether actions aligned with stated values. Schools began inviting Robert to speak to students about service and sacrifice. He discovered that he had stories to tell, lessons to share, wisdom earned through experience that younger generations needed to hear. His voice, which had been silenced by bureaucratic indifference, found new purpose in education and inspiration. Community organizations that had never before considered veteran outreach began developing programs specifically designed to ensure that no veteran was forgotten, overlooked, or turned away. Robert's experience had exposed a gap between intention and action that many people were eager to bridge. The ceremony itself became an annual tradition, but with new protocols that prioritized inclusion over punctuality, understanding over efficiency. Robert was invited to return each year, not as a guest, but as an honored participant whose presence reminded everyone why they were gathered. Years later, when Robert Mitchell passed away at the age of 91, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including Governor Williams, James Morrison, and dozens of veterans who had never served with him but had been inspired by his story. The cemetery service was conducted with full military honors, but more importantly, it was conducted with the kind of community recognition that had eluded him for most of his civilian life. His obituary, published in newspapers across the state, didn't just list his military decorations and service record. It told the story of the day he was almost turned away from his own recognition ceremony and how one person's willingness to speak up, one leader's willingness to do the right thing, and one community's willingness to remember what really mattered had created a moment that reminded everyone present what honor actually looked like in practice. The ceremony program from that day, featuring Robert's recognition and Governor Williams's speech about the importance of putting principles before protocols, was preserved in the state historical archives. But more importantly, it was preserved in the memories of everyone who witnessed the moment when a community chose to do better, to be better, to remember that the people we honor in ceremonies are real individuals with real stories who deserve more than bureaucratic indifference. The lesson of Robert Mitchell's story wasn't complicated or profound in an academic sense. It was simple and profound in a human sense. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is recognize the worth of the person standing in front of you, especially when that person has spent a lifetime serving others. Sometimes leadership means being willing to delay your schedule for someone who has never delayed when duty called. Sometimes honor means making sure that those who have honored us with their service are honored in return, even when it's inconvenient, even when it disrupts plans, even when it challenges the comfortable efficiency of established procedures. The story of the veteran who was almost turned away and the governor who delayed an entire ceremony to include him became more than just a news story or a feel-good moment. It became a reminder of who we can be when we choose to put human dignity above administrative convenience, when we remember that the ceremonies we conduct are meaningless unless they reflect the values we claim to celebrate. In a world where veterans often feel forgotten, where service can seem thankless, where the gap between civilian and military experience can feel insurmountable, Robert Mitchell's story offered something precious. Proof that recognition is possible, that service still matters, that the sacrifices made by one generation on behalf of all generations are still remembered, still valued, still capable of inspiring others to act with honor and integrity. If you believe that those who serve deserve more than our rhetoric, that they deserve our action, that they deserve to be recognized, not just in official ceremonies but in the daily choices we make about how we treat each other, then share this story. Comment below about a veteran in your life who deserves recognition. Because the lesson of Robert Mitchell isn't just about one old soldier and one good governor. It's about all of us and our capacity to choose honor over convenience, humanity over bureaucracy, and respect over indifference every single day.